Who are the characters behind science? This is Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side.
In this podcast, we unveil the human side of laboratories and science. Scientists share personal experiences and we discuss their meanings from different perspectives and fields of research.
Welcome to another episode of Science Behind the Glass, illuminating the human side. The podcast where we delve into the fascinating intersection of science, nature, and humanity. Today, we are thrilled to have Dr. Leanda Mason, an accomplished ecologist and passionate advocate for conservation.
Dr. Leanda Mason has built an impressive career focusing on conservation ecology, tertiary education, and equity, diversity, and inclusion framework. They completed a PhD on the urban ecology of trapdoor spiders and their kin, aiming to understand and conserve this unique breeder. Their research has highlighted the challenges faced by trapdoor spiders in urban environments, particularly due to their short-range endemic trait. Species that are restricted to a very small geographic area and are often highly specialized to their local environment.
Currently, Leanda serves as a Vice Chancellor Research Fellow in the Center for People, Place, and Planet at Edith Cowan University. In this role, Leanda leads interdisciplinary projects exploring the intersections of queer ecology, non-human entities, and Indigenous Australian concepts of country. Leanda's research integrates Indigenous perspectives on the interconnectedness of life forms with temporary ecological studies, challenging dominant anthropocentric views and informing environmental justice practice.
Dr. Leanda is also an enthusiastic science communicator, frequently engaging in public talks, media interviews, and publications to advocate for the conservation of non-charismatic species. Leanda's work has significantly contributed to our understanding of biodiversity and the importance of preserving lesser-known species like the trapdoor spiders.
Leanda, thank you very much for accepting this invitation and for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
To start, what motivates you to specialize in the study of trapdoor spiders, and what personal experiences have shaped your passion for their conservation?
So I wasn't aware that trapdoor spiders even existed until my second year at university, which is quite surprising considering I already had quite a strong interest in anything in the undergrowth. Like I was really interested in leaf litter invertebrates in particular. And then when I was doing my zoology degree, I was a bit of a petulant student. I spoke out to one of the professors there. He was specializing in parasites. So we did do like a zoology unit, an invertebrate zoology unit. And I was really excited to do that unit because invertebrates is like something I was really interested in. But we were focusing on parasite and cnidarians, which are like jellyfish. So I was a bit disappointed because it didn't cover the things that I was really interested in. And then when I was talking to the professor about it, he's like, oh, I'll introduce you to the professor, like this other professor. He's just across the hallway, like just meet me after class. And I was like, okay, cool. So I came and met, and he introduced me to Barbara York Main, who I'd never heard of before. And she was this older, like she was 79 when I met her. She was this old, and I was 19. An older lady, like she was dressed like very petitely, very like lovely. Like she was, she just dressed really well and, kind of old fashioned. Everything was matching. I just had this impression of her being like kind of delicate and unassuming, I guess, in her presence. But then like when I got to know her, I realized that actually that was not like her at all. She's a very strong woman. But when I first met her, she immediately she's like, oh, this is good timing because I was just about to feed my trapdoor spider. She had this live trapdoor spider in like a little planter pot. Like it was full of dirt and that, and it said live spider on the top of it with a grate over the top, but I couldn't see anything in there, right? And when she opened the lid, she put in this cockroach. Quick as a flash, this trapdoor spider jumped out and leaped and got the cockroach. And I made this very feminine exclamation, which I won't repeat, but it was like a gasp. And I'd never seen anything so cool, like in my life. And then I would just pelted her with questions. And she very generously like gave me her book to read and like some of her papers. And she's like, just bring them back. And then, yeah, so I kind of just hung off her for the next 10 years because I was hooked from the beginning, and she was very generous with her time. And yeah, she took me out on country and like showed me where the trapdoor spiders were and like out into the bush and that, and yeah, getting my eye in and teaching me all about them. And it was just really, really lovely to be able to learn like that from her. That's how I got into it.
Yeah, it sounds like a really nice first experience with the species.
Yeah, I feel so privileged and lucky that I got to meet it and be introduced that way.
And how do you change from studying the conservation of these type of spiders to working on EDGI, equity, diversity, justice, and inclusion-based ecology? And also explain us what EDGI is.
So EDGI is a term I came up with to describe kind of the scope. So it's an approach to ecological research that centers on equity, diversity, justice, and inclusion, hence the acronym EDGI. But it's also just a cool acronym, like pushing out the boundaries of what we're currently doing. It recognizes the interconnectedness of social and environmental justice and integrating these principles into study and management of ecosystems. So it kind of just pushes against those more westernized colonial ecological paradigms. So yeah, just trying to bring in as many diverse perspectives and equitable practices in addressing environmental issues. So it's not really a complete change. It's like, because the conservation of trapdoor spiders really fits within that. It's also looking at not just people doing ecology and the interactions with humans, it's presenting the more than human. So it's looking at what kind of, if there's like any taxonomic bias, which there definitely is against spiders generally, and, you know, invertebrates, even though invertebrates constitute 95% of invertebrate, of fauna, of all animal species, 95% is represented by invertebrates. And yet most of the funding goes towards vertebrate species for conservation and the research of that there. So I guess I didn't get a lot of support in funding for trapdoor spiders, and it's kind of easier to pitch like a broader approach, I guess. And it's like, and it already fit with my kind of my social justice, environmental justice mantra, like my own personal values. So it just fits within all of the things that I want to do. I kind of just put them together.
You're out of the curiosity, who introduced this new concept of EDGI, or I guess that is not new, but we are not familiar with.
It's a term that I coined. So EDGI is something that I've come up with as a term, but it's expanding on the queer ecology ideas anyway. So in terms of like, I guess, Western colonial approaches, it's really, and queer ecology is coming still from like the social sciences within that space, if that makes sense. So it's changing the scope and the origin of where that's coming from, because I use a lot of Indigenous knowledges and approaches, as well as like a species, like a more than human perspective as well. So it's like, I think it's kind of just building on that there. It's a new coined word, but it's like coming from a different perspective, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how do you address your research in cultural or anthropological science to connect with ecology problematics?
I address my research by recognizing the interconnectedness of human cultures and ecological systems. So I think we do need to be very careful in recognizing that a lot of our approaches are biased, or there's like a perspective lens over it. So it's coming from our own and human perspectives. So it's very, not always, but it's a bit egocentric how humans are perceiving ecological problems, and it's really difficult to remove those biases without being aware that you are biased. I think there's been a long history, at least in colonial Western science, that science is objective and there's facts and that kind of thing, but it's all generated by humans. So it's not able to be fully objective because of that, because we all hold our personal biases and things like that. It's more about acknowledging the interconnectedness of cultures and ecological systems and how that plays out. You know, you can gain insights to sustainable practices and impacts on ecosystems. So, for example, looking at different cultural ways. In Noongar cultures, I myself have got Menang Noongar heritage, and looking at old ways and how we used to manage and conserve biodiversity. So like totemic associations and things like that as well. That interdisciplinary, intercultural approach really allows to connect to different dimensions and like leading to a more comprehensive, culturally sensitive, holistic way of approaching these kinds of ecology problems. And I think being a part of the Centre for People, Place and Planet really assists with that, because the values that we hold is like anti-colonial, feminist, queer, which really goes against the dominant perspectives in a lot of ways, but especially in my research with ecological problems.
Yeah, that is important, because even in traditional ecological approaches or ecological problematics, even humans are considered like aside from ecosystems, and even more when we are talking about human diversity. I guess this kind of approach may help to improve the ecological science.
Yeah, I think it's just acknowledging that like humans are a problem I mean, I guess I'm coming from a very conservation perspective too. Like you cannot marry the two, and yet that's what's been happening with. And when you say traditional ecology, I think Western colonial ecology. I don't think, because traditional to me is also like old ways, like Noongar ways, Aboriginal ways, which are very sustainable and it's very respectful with the environment. But that's not what we're seeing.
I guess that is like one of the bigger issues that we have, as you mentioned, for example, the spiders that are the missing ones, the animals, there are thousands of them.
They'll be fine.
They will be fine. And then
who cares if they're not? Like that's what I get. People are scared of or disgusted or like
no, and they're scary and they're venomous and then actually, well, nobody knows about them. They're ancient animals that have been here living for ages. So is that
fascinating?
Yes. And it's a hierarchical problem. I would say that because we put like a hierarchy different animals and prioritizing we said in Spanish is hypothesis peluche, like a plush toy hypothesis. That we have this attachment with these beautiful animals and vertebrates, and we really dismiss the rest of them that have a really important role in the ecosystems. And the spiders, starting from, for example, from arthropods or spiders, scorpions, that we completely don't know absolutely anything from them, but we actually obtain a lot from them. For example, from the venom and isolating compounds.
Right. Yeah, and that's when people don't care about spiders like intrinsically, which a lot of people don't, or like non-charismatic fauna, which I think is what you're saying as well. And then I have to give like an economic benefit or like a way that humans will benefit from them in a way that people can understand, which is when I focus on the venom and things like that, because there are like a lot of medical applications. The Sydney funnelweb venom, for example, is being used to treat post-stroke symptoms, and because it's like a neurological impact that the venom is having, so that they found that can be used to mitigate the impacts of a stroke. Like it stops the damage or something. Like I'm not sure exactly how that works, but also things like non-addictive painkillers and targeted insecticides and things like that. So like, and because the venoms are species specific, if we let spiders and scorpions and other venomous creatures, many of which who are invertebrates, go extinct, then we are potentially losing a lot of bioinformation, a lot of things that could be used. And I know that's a very extractivist, a very like taking from species mentality. It's not something that I personally subscribe to, but that's the argument that I have to make for people to be like, oh, actually, maybe we should conserve them because we might be able to use them later. And I find it hard to make those arguments, even though I know that I have to get people to start caring about it's really hard to get people to start caring.
I have the perfect example there. We apply for ARC, that is like a big funding in Australia, and then we have to justify everything with human benefits. And so like with Sydney funnelweb spiders, there's different species, like the venom profiles are different, and that has an impact not only in the antivenom. But we don't know anything about the status of the ecology, how is the conservation, how is the population. There's so much variation, all the variables or components that are affecting not only humans, then we are not going to end up doing anything. But I
know, it's very frustrating. I find it, I'm empathizing with you. And sometimes it's just a matter of who's applying too. And this is where, I think this is where edgy ecology also, it's not just about the species, but it's also about the human dynamics within that, because I think it was 2019, I tried to get this ARC linkage off the ground when it was coming to conserving jewelback trapdoor spiders, which I've got a tattoo of one on my arm, but I have a very strong association with them. They're also critically endangered from the way that I understand critical endangerment. Like with my PhD, I found all of these threatening processes, and the surveys I conducted, there's only one population at Kings Park that I think is actually sustainable. But even then there's arson attacks and things like that happen in Kings Park. So having one population is not enough to preserve a species, as you would imagine. But when I put forward this project, there was very little interest. And I think I made a very strong case to conserve these spiders. And then just recently, some men, I'm going to say men with a lot of external privilege, I was very frustrated.
That's true.
Yeah, with so even though they have a lot of social authority is probably how I would describe that. They're white men, straight, of a certain age. They're both doctors. I won't name who it is because I don't want to name and shame, but like, and it's not their fault, obviously. It's not their fault that they have that privilege, but they also have very little knowledge on trapdoor spiders. And yet, when they were asking the same questions of partners to collaborate with, they were getting lots of, like, they just ask and that's a yes. As opposed to me, who have to, like, I have to make a case and then eventually it's a no or it's just a straight up no. And I'm just like, what is the difference between me asking and them asking? Do you know what I mean? And it's the same question. Is it the timing? Because 2019 as opposed to now, but that's only 5 years. And I asked again recently, like the end of last year, the same question, can we do a breeding program at the zoo? And there was a no. It's like, we don't have the space. And I'm like, well, they're short-range endemics, so they don't need a lot of space, generally speaking. And it's a big zoo. You've got like massive animals. Anyway, I won't get into it, but I was very frustrated with the no. Like it was an unequivocal no. And then they asked more recently and they're like, oh yeah, we can do that. Really frustrated me that was, and they're not experts in trapdoor spiders. So they're actually going to come to me for the information on how to do that.
Yeah, I know. I get it because when we applied twice, and then both my supervisors started like a leading. First was my co-advisor, and then afterwards was my female advisor. And then one of the answers is like, oh, but you don't have like a higher rank. You're not a professor. And she was so angry because it's like, do I need to have associate professor and a title to just get more appealing or like getting more chances to get the funding? And then that's the reality.
It is. It's frustrating because it's like, it doesn't really matter how good your idea is, it's who's saying it sometimes. And I think that's one of the things in ecology that I'm also going to investigate, because it's just so frustrating that hierarchy, even within humans that you were talking about before, like that exists not just in humans, it exists in species and then it exists generally. But how do we make everything a little bit more fair and equitable?
Yes. Yeah. And continuing exactly with this line of thought, how does EDG approach in ecology improve the old or classic ecological research approaches? How are they different? But traditionally, understanding that traditional is not like the indigenous or the communities, but the old or classic ecological research.
Yeah, like colonial, ecocentric.
Exactly.
Extractivist.
Exactly.
I think I think that kind of approach was really focusing on the biological, physical aspects, which is kind of what you were saying before. It was very like humans weren't a part of that equation, or considering those social dimensions at all. So I think those kinds of approaches can definitely marginalize, further marginalize people who are not in the dominant, let's say, culture. So like we were just saying, it's if you're not part of the colonial, or you're existing within that hierarchy, then you're less likely to have an impact in that space because there's barriers that exist to stop you from practicing ecology. And I think we know that that's going to be problematic because, and there is a lot of research that actually, supports this. I know that, I think it was the CIA in America realized that they had to diversify their workforce because they had all of these white men, and then they were missing things because they only had one perspective. So it was too narrow a perspective to actually be useful for the greater population. So I think that there is research that builds on the social dimensions and how important that is in different spaces. But when we're talking about ecology, it's kind of like, we know that it's not sustainable. We know that what we're doing right now is really irreversibly damaging our environments. And yet there has been a lot of resistance to change our ways, like in the colonial way. And I think it's getting better in Australia in terms of like including Indigenous knowledges, because it's kind of like, well, that's been tried and trusted for 65,000 years and demonstrated that that's actually a very sustainable approach. But yeah, bringing in lots of diverse perspectives, I think, and the more than human as well, like the taxonomic bias, which we're discussing with spiders, like that is something that I find so problematic. The non-charismatic species not getting any funding, or just being like, oh yeah, they'll be captured within the funding that's being given to the more charismatic species. Because if we're conserving the charismatic species environment, that means that there'll be an indirect benefit for the invertebrate species, or like the species that are existing to support that one charismatic species. But it doesn't happen. Fake news, I guess, the misinformation, if you give money here and it'll trickle down into communities, that's not what happens though. Like, it's just a lie that we keep getting fed, and it's like, it's really detrimental in so many ways. So I think they are inextricably linked as well.
And with what you say, I think we already had like several decades of ecological research using more or less the same approach. And we still have this crisis. We have this global ecological crisis that we couldn't handle. It hasn't been proven to be working. So
Yeah.
it has to be something in the basis of that. Yeah.
We have to do something about that there. I think it's in like a lot of conservation ecology approaches, objectives, like issues that we know that need to be fixed, then like problems that need solutions, but they're in direct conflict with economic or like other social human endeavors. So I think that's where there's a big conflict between what we can achieve, and we essentially have to like restructure the entire human like dominant culture in terms of like how the globe is running, because this extractivist production capitalist, like I could go on but it's not sustainable. It's a bigger issue than ecological practice, and it's sitting within that. So it's like, how do you address environmental justice without also combating social justice at the same time? Like the two are inextricably linked. So I think even though it's like a really broad, and the ecology is a very broad scope in that, I think it needs to be acknowledged that it has to be a holistic approach.
I completely agree. I think that if we see as a whole ecosystem and how the actually works, and the inclusion of communities or traditional communities and their knowledge, we are not going to really understand how everything works properly, what like factors are affecting them, and how all the species and changing in a way. And we have a guest that was saying like when we figure out that at the end of the tunnel, like there's an endangered species, like well, actually just it's late, because the full ecosystem had been just wiped out. The forest is late. They are like at the end of the
they're just holding on barely. So we need to focus on like prevention rather than, getting to that point where they're nearly extinct and then being like, oh, they're nearly extinct, we need to do something. Like, well, yeah, can you think about before they get to that point, I think is what you're saying. So yeah, I totally agree with that too. And it's very frustrating. But there's still we have unprecedented amounts of clearing in Australia. Like it's one of the highest native habitat clearing in the world. And yet I don't know why we have this perception that that's not what's happening. Like I see Perth expanding very rapidly. Like I remember for my PhD, I was mapping the urban sprawl. So there was aerial photographs taken in the 1950s, and it was like you could see where the native bush, like the line was before it had been cleared. And it was, I don't know, for those of you who like know Perth, there's expanded like maybe 3 times the size in 50 years. Like in terms of population density, there's a very low population density in the outer suburbs as well, which causes all kinds of economic problems in terms of access to transport, public health and things, getting to hospital. At schooling, like it's not good for anyone to have urban sprawl. I understand with, the pandemic that people are like, oh, it's good to be isolated. Perth was not bad, but it's bad for the environment. And it's bad for a lot of other reasons, like social reasons as well, social determinants of health in particular. So yeah, let's just not keep clearing. I think that's probably, and farmland as well, like it's.
I agree, but like as you're coming up with this idea that actually we need sooner or later to be more inclusive, like looking from other perspective, because it hasn't been working for many decades. So we have to come up with different perspective and looking in a different way.
Yeah, I'd say centuries, to be honest. Like to me, it kind of started with the Industrial Revolution, or like even farming practices, like when humans started changing from like that initial change, like staying in the one place and raising crops. That I think started it all, and that really extractivist mentality from the environment, not that synergy. And I think a lot of First Nations peoples, like around the world, like they have very strong connections to country and they want to look after it, but with all this movement and globalization, we've lost connection with place and belonging and feeling like we care for the place that we're in because we can just move. And I think that underlying mentality is not great. So I think there's a lot of, again, it gets quite complicated, but I think it did start before the Western side, like before Darwin and all that kind of stuff. I think it started way before that, and it just kept building like incrementally. So it's not an overnight thing. But we do definitely need to change the ways now. And I think, especially with the huge population that the planet's trying to support, like the human species, it's just.
And in what ways research studies overlook or marginalize the roles of sex and gender diversity in ecosystems? How does queer ecology address these gaps?
Like I was saying before, queer ecology is coming from it's still within the colonial construct, because it's still within like an academic sense is kind of where I'm coming from with that. The queer ecologies come across from the social sciences. So it's almost like within that hierarchical structure, it's come across, and like it's good in terms of deconstructing the patriarchy and deconstructing, the gender norms within that, and acknowledging that there's diverse sexuality in ecosystems. Like humans, I think, there's a very small percentage of species that are monogamous or like that are like heterosexual, I guess, like purely heterosexual. So, and humans aren't, obviously, but like to acknowledge that that's a very natural thing, I think, is coming across from that perspective. I mean, I remember talking to someone recently about bonobos, and they were like, what are bonobos, for one? One of our closest relatives in terms of like the great apes, like chimpanzees and bonobos are probably our closest cousins, and yet they have very different approaches to sex. And it's very interesting. It's like bonobos essentially make love, not war, whereas chimpanzees are very like conflict, they have a lot of conflict and aggression that isn't resolved. But bonobos do resolve a lot of that through sex. So I think it's really challenging those normative assumptions, or like what's considered the dominant ideals culturally. But again, it's coming from a human perspective. So I think with queer ecology, that's what they're kind of looking at. It's undermining the dominant norm that is perpetuated within human cultures, because it's not a norm, generally speaking. And it's pretty much been imposed. It's like undermining those dualisms, the binary thinking. It's very Cartesian. And I think the Cartesian theories did arise from a lot of the social theories, which is why I think it's come across from the social sciences to undermine that. And it's then been applied to ecological interactions at a species level in particular.
Yeah, that is very interesting, because we are like interpolating these concepts from human communities that are very complex, and we kind of understand in some aspects, and we interpolate them to nature. That is very interesting. So
it's almost like a projection.
Yeah, exactly. So how queer ecology integrates social justice into this equation, into ecological research and practice, and what implication might this have for future research and policy?
I'll answer the first part of the question. So part of my research will be exploring the differences between those two things. I think from what I'm understanding at the moment, ecology, like edgy in the way that that I've coined that term, is like a broader scope. They're both, loaded terms, obviously, and they both are looking at incorporating social justice principles into ecological studies, but they're focusing on different aspects and address different issues. So like the approach and the objectives are going to be a bit different anyways. So edgy ecology is kind of more of a broader inclusion, like it's looking at more than species approaches and other things like, Indigenous knowledge wasn't and hasn't been highlighted much in queer ecology. Like I can only think of one example that I've read, and that's from Kim Tallbear, who connects queer ecology with Indigenous perspectives and kinship models. But there's definitely, in terms of like moving forward in a sustainable way, in ecological approaches, Indigenous knowledge systems are so, especially I'll say with Noongar, I'll talk about my own culture. We are the land is us. Like we're not separated from that. And I think that's a really important way of looking at ecology moving forward, is like, because I think colonial Western approaches, what you're saying is traditional, is kind of like the very separate, observant like perspective. So it's like, this is what's happening, and we're removed from that. And I think queer ecology is kind of based in that just because of where it's come from. But I think it's important moving forward that we build on that. Like I'm not saying queer ecology is bad. Obviously, it's great that it was undermining all of that there, but I think it needs to be a little bit more inclusive in the perspectives that it's taking as well. Personally, obviously, I'm still exploring this space, so it's probably that was the direction that queer ecology was going in anyway, because it's the next logical step. But how do we integrate those kinds of, justice and social inclusion perspectives? That will inform policy, because policy, I think, is about justice. That's how I understand it anyway. It's like it's trying to not legalize, but like put in place some structure that allows for people to be protected when they're doing this kind of stuff. So policy is kind of for like putting policy in place to protect animals, for example, like you know, putting in protections for invertebrate species when I found out recently that invertebrate fauna don't have any protections whatsoever, and they're not even really considered fauna according to this biodiversity thing that I was reading. I was like, okay, so there's like zero protection essentially, unless they've got a priority status, which trapdoor spiders don't at the moment. So policies to protect trapdoor spiders, but for whatever reason that's been taken back. So I think it's important to recognize that even though it's in the future, it might be less progressive in some places if we're not fighting for it. So it's important to try to push for these things in a really, like, in an edgy way, I guess, to try and push the boundaries. But there's always that chance that it'll go backwards. You know, it's like one step
that
forward,
is scary.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a good example when I was learning recently about doing a review for the dugong in all Pacific Islands. Well, I learned so much about this animal, but then in the New Caledonia, they noticed that all the marine parks and all the policies around the marine parks weren't matching with the distribution of the dugong and the seagrass that they rely on.
Yeah.
So this researcher was like, this is ridiculous. You are just putting in a space where there's absolutely anything there. And then the actual animal where it's living, when it's breathing, where it's eating this, is not protected. So it's just like a randomly, we have 80% of the marine parks around.
And there's probably other reasons they thought that was a good place to protect. And that's the thing. It's like, if you focus, like, I love dugongs, don't get me wrong, but yeah, if you're focusing on other aspects, it might have been like fishing reasons and all that kind of stuff. Like, it wasn't that they were protecting areas that weren't used for fishing, or like there's a lot of cultural aspects. So it's like, well, why are you doing it? It doesn't make sense, but it does make sense in the bigger context of like human developments and economic incentives and all of that there. So it's very frustrating for people that genuinely care about the environment, because it's in direct conflict with things that other people care about. But I think that's where it's the social equity and the environmental justice. I wonder why people don't care so much about environment when we're so heavily reliant on it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like cutting out our lungs.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I just...
Kicking the lunchbox.
So I think it is heavily cultural, though, because, like... Yeah, Aboriginal cultures around the world, like First Nations peoples around the world, like, understand how intrinsically linked we are. So I think we just need a big cultural shift in a lot of ways to be a little bit more respectful of the place that we're in. Yeah.
How this incorporating equality, diversity, justice, and inclusion into ecological research enhance our understanding and management of populations and ecosystems. Can you provide insights on your own research? I know that you give some examples already, but maybe you can expand a little bit more.
Yeah, I think the difference between equality and equity, and it's something that I teach in university, so that's why I'm kind of picking up on it. Equality is where you treat everyone the same. Equity is kind of like acknowledging that there is difference and accommodating for that difference. So it definitely is equity that I'm focusing on, because a lot of, like, we know that species operate differently within ecosystems, and therefore we need to have an understanding of that in order to conserve appropriately. But yeah, I guess in my own research, I've noticed more, like I started from a very Western point with my PhD. Like, I was trained in a university, and it's like, this is the things that you must do. And I didn't even question it sometimes, like taking specimens from the environment and not even thinking, and like having them, like, that's just what you do. You just take invertebrate, like, you just take trapdoor spiders. And then as I learned more about them, I found it really problematic and really hard. Like, a lot of these trapdoor spiders that we're taking out of the environment might be older than I am. You know, like, it was difficult, and yet didn't seem to be, because they're invertebrates, nobody seemed to care. And then I was just, but they have similar lifespans, and they're just of like a lot of vertebrate species that have similar rights. And anyway, so I guess I started questioning it more and more as I got older. And when I started I realized that nobody gave a crap. Nobody really cared about invertebrates generally. And that was something I had to reconcile, because I was just like, I didn't mean to assume that other people would just care, but because I care so much, it was something that I guess I found it really hard to to understand why. But yeah, so that was the basis of my PhD, was looking at trapdoor spiders as surrogates for all of these other invertebrate species that weren't able to be researched because they're like rare or hard to capture data for. So a lot of the invertebrate species, it's not just that people don't want to study them, but they are just hard to study as well because of the data deficiency. We're starting from like baseline studies a lot of the time, like there's just nothing on them. So people don't want to invest their time and effort into doing that because it's like, especially with PhDs and things, you want to build on the existing literature and you want to get your PhD, and it's like, it's really hard to break new ground. But I think it's something that we need to be applauding people for actually even trying and recognizing that there are barriers to doing these kinds of things, rather than like when you're doing publishing and they say like, oh, what were the limitations of your research? And it's like, you're listing all of these things, and then they're like, well, what are your findings? And it's like, well, I found this, this, and this, but they're like, oh, but there's all these conflicting things. And it's like, yeah, but that's just the nature of what we're studying, and it's like baseline, and we don't know these things. So it's really hard to build an argument under the scientific regime that's been put in place by these traditional methods, like this hierarchy of academia, or like, you know, the structures that are put in place in government and policy and that kind of thing, to like justify why you're doing things. You always have to justify, but it's like there's nothing to build on. So you're just starting from scratch all the time, which is exhausting. Sorry, that was a bit of a side tangent. But in terms of specific examples, like the short-range endemism, there's not enough investment in the conservation of invertebrates and other non-charismatic species. So I really was focusing on how to build an argument that you can do this research and there is like broad implications. So short-range, like I was focusing on the traits because it's kind of like, well, this will then broadly apply hopefully to some of the other invertebrates that we know, like snails. And, you know, there's a lot of like little schizomids. There's a lot of little invertebrates that do have short-range endemic traits, and then we can kind of extrapolate, but then scientists don't like the word extrapolate because it's all speculative, you know, like, but we can hopefully have at least a little bit more information about how they might respond to certain threatening processes ecologically. So I found that invasive species, like invasive grass in particular, was really one of the biggest threats in Perth because it was completely, it was called veld grass. It's like, it was completely taking out the understory. So it was like replacing the shrubs and things, there's many different species, and it was just a monoculture of this grass. So it was looking more like an African savanna than it was, you know, the Banksia woodland that I grew up with. Yeah, because it's changed, like the habitat's changed so dramatically. All the invertebrate species, like it went from places where the veld grass wasn't invading, and it wasn't just the species diversity, but that was huge, and species abundance that was huge. And it was like dropping so rapidly by comparison to where the veld grass is, that it was probably why the trapdoor spiders is like there's no prey species for them. So it was like a small ecosystem collapse starting from the bottom up. But then people are like, oh, why are the vertebrates not here? And it's like, well, they don't have anything to eat. Like if my trapdoor spiders don't have anything to eat, the vertebrates won't have any. Like it's starting from the bottom up, the collapse, and then. But people aren't looking at invertebrates, so it'll be, again, too late. They're like, oh, all these vertebrates are being affected like 10 years later because nothing's there for them. So yeah, that ecosystem approach, it's like you can't just focus on one top animal, like species, and think that everything else is going to be fine, because it's not. You actually have to look at the whole thing. So
yeah, it's right. And you said something very important that most people don't care, even people who are supposedly trying to research and understand these topics, probably they don't care, because for understanding and management properly something, you must care about it. So that might be the key to these kind of processes.
Yeah, but how do you get people to care? Like I was saying, that's why I have to make those arguments about the economics and things like that. It's almost from birth. Like it's a cultural shift that we're talking about. You know, people care about what they're almost like not indoctrinated, but taught to care about. They embody the values of people around them as well, the societal values, like in terms of nature versus nurture. And that's what I was kind of saying with I wasn't even really questioning that extractivist nature of what I was doing at the time. Like I know better now, and I'm trying to actively work against it. But if I hadn't had that I guess I'm lucky in that my mum's quite the feminist as well. Like she teaches, like she taught me very young to question everything, which was a double-edged sword anyway. Like it's frustrating to question everything and then have like very frustrating answers or like no answers. But yes, I guess it depends on how you've grown up as well as your interests and like intrinsic nature and nurture type.
Yeah.
But how do we culturally shift that so that people do start caring?
Yeah.
Or at least recognizing that it's going to be fundamental to our ongoing existence as a species. So we need to do something even if you don't care. Do you know what I mean? Like it's.
But that comes a part of the interconnectedness with all the nature and with all the aspects of our ecosystem, not only a tiny little bit, and how we see us as a humans, a part of these ecosystems, and not with like a third one, just looking how the ecosystem develops or evolves. So yeah, it's sad that we have to fall in the same practices, like trying to justify, for example, I use the short endemics to just point out like we need to know what is happening with these populations, not just getting all the animals. They didn't even know. So give a little bit of context, like when they were catching the male funnel web spiders, is that it's really tricky when they are juveniles to know if it's a female or a male. Mm-hmm. But then people were catching everything, and they took them there into the reptile park, and then we went there like, but why do you have females here? Oh, we are trying to breed them, but you don't know anything about the breeding process. So I said like, well, yeah, cool that you try, but you need to understand the ecological part of these animals, because they are super sensitive to any vibration. It was just a completely failure in the breeding process. And when they bring the tiny little ones, it's like we were trying to teach them like, hey, there's a way to identify males. And then, well, their sex ratio is quite different, because apparently it's like it's not proportional, one male, one female. But
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, we collecting, at least when we collect, then like a number of males were lower. But this is what they.
But that's still in their life history.
No, exactly. And the lifespan is shorter.
Yeah. Yes. So you're going to get that disproportion because of the life history.
Yeah. So when I studied the spiders, I was including juveniles, and I was including mostly females, because this was the most common. And the males, when I have males by chance, they just survive in laboratory conditions 3 months, and it's like
they stop eating.
They eat. Some of them eat, but then the lifespan was shorter. I was just looking after them. They were the princess.
Well, yeah, I tried to keep a male alive, like that I found, and yeah, he just refused to eat. So I wonder if, again, it could be a species thing as well.
Yeah.
So it's like we can't even just say trapdoor spiders. We have to be like, well, these ones do this and these ones do that, and that's something that. It's very frustrating though, yeah. I think because you can't, again, like we were going to try and do some captive breeding, and this is something that I was talking about before. Like I was very frustrated that that's something that I wanted to, but I do know a lot about the ecology because I've been out in the field, I've seen them where they are, what their preferences are, documented them. Like I know what they need, and yet there's people coming in that are trying to help, but they're just so uninformed, and I think that's where the frustration lies. It's just like, yeah, you need to get all of this information before you do this other thing. Which I think people recognize with vertebrates, but I don't understand why they don't see that for other species. It's like, oh yeah, they'll be fine because they're invertebrates. It's like, no, they're in and themselves. Like just because something has a backbone doesn't mean that it's different in that like such a substantial way. Like they're different species, but the way that we've categorized them is just like better than and less than, essentially. Exactly. And I think that's what you're really up against.
And the complexity of these animals is so amazingly complex, and
they've been around for so much longer, so it's like it actually makes sense that they're so much more like in tune with their environment. Do you know what I mean? Like as if anything, vertebrates are probably way easier to look after than invertebrates because of what you're saying with like the sensitivity to the vibrations and all the kind of microhabitats. Like they're microhabitat specialists, we know that's part of their short range endemic traits.
So, what challenges have you faced in advocating for equity, diversity, and inclusion in education, particularly? And how do you stay motivated to push for change?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question because as I was doing my PhD, I didn't end up in the equity, diversity, inclusion space on purpose. Let's put it that way. I encountered a lot of barriers, like cultural differences, things that I found that were unjust when I was going through my PhD. And I think people who don't have a lot of privilege will probably resonate with that. They're kind of like, yeah, there's all of these barriers that people don't seem to see if they don't have the same kind of background. So I ended up going into diversity, equity, and inclusion because of like who I am as a person. And I saw all of these like injustices that were happening for myself, but I didn't want to happen to other people like me, I guess. And when I ended up working for the Centre for Aboriginal Studies, which was great. Like I learned a lot about my culture, and that was an awesome experience. But again, like I then experienced another level of like systemic racism that occurs because I present as very fair, I wasn't privy to until I was like openly talking about Aboriginal ways of being, and people were like attacking my identity and things like that. So anyway, I'd already experienced that with my sexuality and my gender identity, but not so much with my Aboriginality. So I think that's where I came into being very interested in the social equity side of things, the social justice space, because I could see how it was impacting not just like my opportunities in research and environment, but how that might affect ecology more generally. If you're not getting diverse voices coming through and perspectives coming through, then perhaps why that we still have that colonial approach, and it's really only just starting to come through as the social equity is like increasing. So again, it's that holistic approach. So there was personal challenges, but in my role as a tertiary educator, so I've been teaching at university for like 15 years now, and like I started too young, don't get me started. I started teaching, I was unit coordinating these first year units that were looking at infusing Aboriginal perspectives into science and into health as well. And the resistance from some students was really surprising, I guess. There was a lot of people coming to the classroom that had these pre-existing stereotypes and biases against Aboriginal peoples that they'd heard in like the media, or like they had this kind of confirmation bias that they've heard these stereotypes and then they've seen it and experienced like a negative interaction, and then they're like bringing that into the classroom. So there was a lot of unlearning, or like recognizing those biases and prejudices that they held before they could learn about the content. And some students didn't come in, like they were culturally harmful students, and then they left because they continued to resist and they were still culturally harmful. I mean, a lot of students are quite receptive, and I don't mean to like generalize, but that was one of the challenges that I found, is that, and then because they were often from a privileged background, they would push back and complain, and then they would be heard. But in the greater scope, it's kind of like, well, this is the whole point of the unit, is that we're trying to push for social equity and change. And it is going to be a very uncomfortable space for students to recognize their own prejudice and a lot of uncomfortable feelings and thoughts, but that's where growth happens. Like that, at least for me, like it was really uncomfortable, and it's still uncomfortable to look back and all of the things that I was doing previously, like taking trapdoor spiders as specimens and like not even thinking, like just taking and things like that. And yeah, I think it's hard, but like once you know to do better, you can do better. I think that's a Maya Angelou quote. But yeah, some people just still resist, and I think that's the challenge, is that they just don't want to change. But I think in terms of staying motivated, I surround myself with other people who recognize that, you know, other people that are really advocating for change and like-mindedness and share the similar frustrations of what's happening in the world. And it's nice to have that sense of solidarity, and it's almost like a sense of belonging, because it's like our ideologies are matching. And I guess humans do tend to do that. They go with like-minded people or like people. And in my case, it's like like-minded people, not people who look like me, which I think it's a hard, I think, yeah, it's almost going against our nature in a lot of ways. But I think moving forward, we will start to recognize humans as a species rather than like the cultural differences or like physical differences that we have that have accumulated over time, like being on separate continents and things like that. But now that we're all together and we're mixing, and that's a better thing in a lot of ways, I think. Like diversity, I highly value in all spaces. Like it's just a more resilient, not just in ecosystems, like in terms of biodiversity, but in terms of cultures, like it's a more resilient way of being. because it's more adaptive. If something comes up, a pandemic, for example, like some cultures are naturally going to know, naturally know what to do. I mean, we talk about the differences between the approaches in Australia, for example. This is an example I gave in the health unit that I was teaching, that no one approach is going to be the best approach. Like Western science developed a vaccine. I took the vaccine. I'm not saying that I didn't. Because I live in a city, it made sense. But there's other ways of approaching the same pandemic. And in remote communities, Aboriginal communities, everyone just isolated. Like they cut off community. And you could do that because it was remote and there's only certain roads that go in. Elders were protected, that kind of thing. I think there was only like 2 Aboriginal peoples in remote communities that ever got COVID. That's how effective that methodology was. And yet, when we're talking about Aboriginal communities, people focus on the deficit discourse where they're like, yeah, but the uptake of the vaccine was so minimal, and they focus on that. And it's like, well, yeah, but in practicality, that doesn't matter. Like there was still very low rates of COVID, like much lower rates of COVID, culturally speaking, because it was like people just stayed in community on country, didn't move anywhere, which is like an old way of doing things anyway. So if we didn't have cities, we probably wouldn't have had the same impacts of the pandemic. Anyway, that's a bit of a weird example, but that's kind of, I think people are just so quick to jump to what they already believe sometimes without even questioning it. And when it comes to deficit discourse, that is something that happens with Aboriginal cultures, for sure.
And could you describe a rewarding moment in your career when your work made tangible impact on the community and or environment?
Yeah, so me and a friend, her name's Cassie Lynch. She has this connection with some trapdoor spiders in the Parongarup. So we both have totemic associations with trapdoor spiders. And she'd been watching this, and she was asking me about them because that was my research, and she was really interested in learning more about them. And I was like, oh yeah, we can go have a look at there. And then she found out, like this is after that they were going, like after I'd discussed them with her, and she was like really excited to learn more about this population. It was really nice that we could share that in cultural way too. And yeah, and then we found out that there's going to be this pathway put in over the top of, like they were already along the pathway periphery, these trapdoor spiders. And I think it's probably because they like a little bit of bare ground as part of their microhabitat. And the human construction had actually allowed for once, like a beneficial amount of microhabitat to be exposed, because there was like a bit of a gradient between where the path was and where the leaf line was. And that's where all the trapdoor spiders really liked that patch. So they were all along the sides of this path, like a huge amount of them. And then the local government was going to put in a paved path. So they decided to increase the width and make it concrete, as opposed to just like a dirt path. And in terms of reasoning that they were doing that, it was to be more accessible for people with wheelchairs and things like that. So I can understand, so that's like the cultural, social equity almost versus the environmental justice and equity. So I was kind of like, yeah, that would be great if people with wheelchairs can access nature. Like it's a nice thing, but also it was going to impact very heavily on these trapdoor spiders. Like hundreds of these individuals were going to get entombed in this concrete if they were going to do the thing they were doing. And so Cassie, my friend, approached the local government and was like, oh, what's happening here? You're going to impact on these trapdoor spiders. It's not okay. They're very, very long lived, and we don't like all of these things. And the local government were like, they're locally abundant. So, and they're invertebrates. So yeah, no, we weren't going to do anything about them, and not like they're just going to pave over the top of them, essentially. So we kind of rallied, and we were kind of, well, is it okay if we try to move them? Because I've done translocation experiments before and have been quite successful in that, like maybe 1 or 2 spiders, but I think it could be applied to a bigger amount. And there were hundreds that were going to get impacted. So like, well, maybe we just start moving them. And we were going to move them when it was a bit more, like the soil was a bit more damp and easier to dig up, but they shifted it forward even. So it was like all very last minute. And so we tried to move them as quickly as possible. And our friend Loxley, who's also really into invertebrates and spiders and stuff, she had all of these volunteers that she had connections with, and she's just like, oh, we'll get the community involved and they'll come up and they'll help. And they did. And they dug all of these, like, just alongside the burrows. And because part of the method, like the ways of getting the trapdoor spiders out, is you dig a big trench next to the burrow and then go in from the side. Because if you dig over the top, then you're likely to damage or like hurt and kill the spider. And we organized these volunteers to like just dig these big trenches next to the burrows, and then I'd come in, and some of the volunteers were actually willing to like help dig up the spiders as well, because I was showing them how, like, to come in from the side and then like take them out, and then we put them in this patch that was far enough away, and that we could observe, like, you know, whether or not they were successful in translocation. And they were, like, pretty much all of the ones that we translocated survived. But yeah, it was just a really good, like, and some of the community members were scared of trapdoor spiders, like they were scared of the spiders, but they were more than willing to dig the trenches, which I thought was like really lovely. That even, and this is what I was saying, like, even though they were scared, like not even apathetic, but scared of the spiders, they still recognized them as like important parts of the ecosystem, and they wanted to help. So that was like, to me, that was even more meaningful, because it wasn't like they were doing it in spite of any kind of fear that they had, which I think was really a beautiful thing. And they helped, and we saved all these spiders, and it was like, it was a good community effort, and everyone kind of felt good that they could do something, and the power still went in. So it was like, this is like, I mean, in terms of equity, socially, that was nice as well. But I thought it was just a really lovely collaboration, and the spiders benefited. It was nice. It just felt nice because everyone got involved, and it was a good outcome for once.
Okay, there is the light of hope in this interview.
It was really nice, and I think a part of it was awareness. Like, a lot of them didn't know that the trapdoor spiders were there, even because they are quite camouflaged. So unless you're looking for them, you might not see them. But yeah, a lot of the times people are like, "Oh, I just never knew." They didn't even know. Like, a lot of them, the trapdoor spiders were in Western Australia, because there is a lot of information on city funnel webs and things. Even though I keep beating my drum and doing all these public talks, people still don't really. And Barbara was around, 60 years before me doing the same thing, and yet there doesn't seem to be that same level of awareness here, which is interesting too.
Thank you very much for your time and sharing all this knowledge and this perspective, and teaching us and reminding us of this interconnectedness and things that we have to do to like a better world, for a better change. And thank you for sharing your point of view. Yeah, I know that sometimes sounds like a disappointing and frustrating, but starting from the point that you're starting and how do you see things, and we sharing these stories not only here with English speakers, but also with Spanish speakers. So that's it's cool, because it's like I help people like, oh, I didn't have an idea that it lived so long. Like, you report one that was 43 years, 45 years?
43, yeah. 43,
and died because of the parasite.
Yeah, parasitic wasp, got it. So could have been even longer. I know, it's amazing.
And longer. Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
We hope that you have enjoyed this episode. This episode was inspired by curiosity. If you want to know more about our host, we will leave the references in the podcast description. Remember that this podcast is self-funded and self-edited by its presenters. You can support us by listening to this episode and sharing the episode with your friends. Also, remember that you find this episode in YouTube and Spotify. Follow us in our social media, Xbox, Instagram, and X. Original music by our colleague and friend Bernardo Aguila, and the help and technical advice for our amazing friend Rafael Giordano.